Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. On behalf of the Global Research Network, I am delighted to welcome you to today's roundtable, Theory, Wildlife, and the Law. My name is Yuriko Otomo, and I have the pleasure of directing the Global Research Network, a community of scholars committed to interdisciplinary, international, and impactful research. We're honored to host this event as part of our Animals and Biodiversity think tank, one of several programs we run that brings together academics and practitioners from around the world. Today's gathering reflects the spirit of our network, intellectually rigorous, politically relevant, and engaged with the most urgent crises of our time. So this event, centered on the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy, which Richard will be speaking about shortly, asks a powerful and timely question. How can theory shape and inspire legal change in the face of ecological collapse and systemic neglect of animal lives? As someone whose own academic work sits within critical animal studies, I'm especially heartened by this conversation. My co-edited book, Law and the Question of the Animal, was an early attempt to interrogate the presumptions that structure the regulation of human-animal relations. And what we're seeing now, I believe, is a rich and necessary theoretical turn in wildlife law, one that challenges us to move beyond the technocratic solutions and towards a deeper reimagining of law's role in the more than human world. So I warmly encourage you to participate fully in today's discussion and to consider joining the Global Research Network's growing community. Our Animals and Biodiversity program welcomes scholars and practitioners alike who are working at the intersection of law, theory, and the lives of animals, and we'll be thrilled to support your work. Thanks again for coming, and I hope that this is the beginning of many conversations to come on the topic. Over to you, Ian. No, over to you, Richard, probably first to present on the journal, and then to Ian, the wonderful organizer of today's event.
Thank you very much indeed, Yuriko, and welcome everyone to this exciting roundtable on theory, wildlife, and the law. I'm Dr. Richard Cadell, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy, where I'm very ably assisted by Ian, who will be shortly joining us as a co-editor-in-chief. So exciting things going on there. When the journal was initially launched way back in 1998, it was very much focused on the minutiae of the various wildlife treaties and really looking at it from an institutional perspective. And it was primarily made up of wildlife geeks that were interested in how international organizations largely functioned. Over the years, the journal has largely focused on a wide variety of different themes of international wildlife law. But one thing that really sort of struck us over the last couple of years is that we focus on the what, but not necessarily on the why. Why are we doing this? What underpins what we're seeking to achieve in international wildlife law? And this marvelous special edition is an attempt, or first attempt, I think, really, for us to get to grips with why wildlife law functions the way it does and what are the underpinning values of what we're trying to achieve with this. And in a way, we sort of blend the emerging strands of wildlife law and animal law and try to bring those two broader themes together under a more conceptual heading. So this is a very, very welcome new theoretical direction. And if you've had a chance to read Ian's marvelous editorial to the special issue, you'll see that this is very much what we see as a theoretical turn in international wildlife law, and an opportunity really for us to explore fundamentally what we're now trying to achieve. So just as we're sort of reflecting with the journal coming up to its 30th birthday, it's a wonderful opportunity for us really to engage with these deeper questions and to infuse international wildlife law with some of these questions have now started to be asked, certainly within the animal law fraternity and within the wider community of environmental lawyers. So without further ado, I'll hand back to Ian to kick us off with this marvelous roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much to you, Eurico, and your Global Research Network think tank on animals and biodiversity for hosting this authors roundtable. And thank you to Richard for all of the fantastic work that you do with the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy, and also for inviting me to guest edit this special issue, which was such a pleasure. As you'll see from our roundtable today, we have an incredible collection of authors who have contributed to this special issue, who I'm very much looking forward to hearing from. So you'll get to hear some insights from all of their work and reflections from our two discussants, all of whom I will introduce in due course. But to get us started, I wanted to share a few reflections that occurred to me in the process of drafting my editorial and reflecting on the contributions to this special issue. And I'll begin by setting the scene for us a little bit. So Earth's wildlife has been facing deteriorating and challenging conditions that stem from breached planetary boundaries and which inspire reflection upon international wildlife law's modus operandi, which I think this special issue does in quite a nice way. Our world today looks quite different to the world that saw enactment of treaties like the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species or the Convention on Biological Diversity. And while international wildlife law has achieved various successes over the years, I'm seeing that there is a growing appetite to assess the extent to which it remains sufficiently calibrated to present contexts, amongst other things, the context of the Anthropocene. This, I think, is evident in the way international wildlife law scholars are increasingly seeking to motivate and conceptualize changes to the law, as well as to reconceptualize fundamental legal concepts and even the notion of law itself. The authors in this special issue engage with all of these questions and contribute to, as Richard said, what we've begun referring to as an emerging theoretical turn in international wildlife law scholarship. And I very much think it's the right time for this. So let me tell you a couple of things about the growth of international wildlife law and this turn to theory as I see it. International wildlife law crystallized as a scholarly domain following the enactment of some flagship conservation treaties, and there was a flourishing of early scholarship in the 80s and 90s. The Journal on International Wildlife Law and Policy, as Richard mentioned, was founded in 1998, in particular to address the legal response to human interactions with wildlife that might lead to species extinction and ecosystem destruction. It also addresses and has addressed the utilitarian and moral implications of these things, with a particular emphasis being placed upon the growing set of international institutions that have been created to govern wildlife. The clear objective of this scholarship over the years has been to advance legal objectives to avoid species extinction by offering protection to both wild spaces and to wildlife. And that's wildlife both in the wild and in captivity. It's also observable that throughout the journal's history, there is an undercurrent of concern for animal welfare that exists within the scholarship and which has often been explored. So in all of these regards, international wildlife law has largely been decisively doctrinal, and this has been warranted by its scope and its history, though it has over the years produced some theoretical positions and priorities which have more recently begun to grow swiftly and creatively. In my editorial for this special issue, I provide an overview of the history of international wildlife law's engagement with theory in various pieces of work, including some leading books by Lister, Bauman, Davis, and Redgewell, and Gillespie, which many of the room will be familiar with, and in scholarship by various scholars, including Angus Nurse, Werner Schultz, Katie Wollaston, Karen Bradshaw, and many others. In my editorial, I also provide an overview of theoretical works within the journal throughout its history. These contributions have primarily emphasized considerations of ethics, justice, and animal rights, as well as the philosophical value of wildlife. Interestingly, within the journal, the interaction between wildlife law and animal law, between conservation and welfare objectives, has provided a fruitful ground for theory. Perhaps this is because the interaction between these two raises philosophical questions, such as those regarding the value of animal life, the nature of animal flourishing and suffering, and also the associated responsibilities of human beings in response to these things. So before we turn to our authors to hear about the fantastic works that they've included in this special issue, let me tell you a little bit overarchingly about how this special issue in particular engages with theory. The special issue features scholarship that engages theory in methodologically and substantively distinct ways, and it responds to gaps and inefficiencies in the law that can frustrate the thriving of wildlife. The contributions range from those that are primarily legal scholarship that also mine theory for normative support for law and policy change, to primarily theoretical scholarship that also considers legal application. Interestingly, the authors in the issue reflect on both planetary crises impacting wildlife in the age of the Anthropocene, and also on animal welfare crises. And this reflects the significant and growing overlap between environmental and animal legal scholarly domains. I think the work in this issue highlights the value of theoretically driven legal research in response to severe ecological decline and insufficient legal responses to this. And I think the time is right for international wildlife law scholarship to deepen its theoretical roots, to deeply reflect on its modus operandi, and to experiment both boldly and decisively with more multi-species normativities. I think that the sobering scale and depth of human-induced ecological and animal welfare crises certainly suggest that legal intervention in order to improve the material conditions for Earth's wildlife is our solemn responsibility. So, ending on that message, I now turn to our fantastic group of authors. And I'll note at the outset that unfortunately Eliane Verniers can't join us today, but you can read her fantastic work in our special issue online. So each author will have...
So sorry to interrupt, Ian.
Yes,
would you mind letting people in the lobby, because I don't have the organizer details to do it, the
yes,
access privileges.
I can do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yuriko. I'll keep track of the lobby throughout. Okay, so turning now to our authors. Each author is going to present an introduction to the work that they included in this special issue in a presentation of around 5 minutes or so. And for our authors, just so you know, I will raise my hand when 5 minutes has elapsed. So at that point, if you could just start to wrap up so we can give time to the next speaker, that would be fantastic. So we are starting with Alice Di Concetto, who is the Chief Legal Advisor at the European Institute for Animal Law and Policy. And Alice will be talking about her journal article, Beyond Ecological and Economic Value, taking into account wild animals' inherent interests in EU environmental law. So I will place your slide here, Alice, and whenever you're ready, you're welcome to take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful roundtable. So my article starts with presenting the differences and the conflicts that might exist between two approaches to animal protection, which are environmental ethics and animal ethics. And I really talk about the dominant trends in those respective ethics, because obviously there are many environmental ethics, there are many animal ethics too, but I really talk about the dominant trends and how dominant environmental ethics often conflict with dominant animal ethics. So typically, when we usually summarize that issue, we typically say proponents of environmental ethics tend to value animals for their ecological value, so what animals bring to ecosystems, while proponents of animal ethics tend to see individual animals as opposed to species, for instance, and they tend to consider that all individual animals, regardless of their species, regardless of their ecological value, are worthy of moral consideration. And then I looked at EU wildlife law, and I really identify markers of dominant environmental ethics in the way that typically EU wildlife law prioritizes the protection of animals from species with bad conservation status, or the protection of species that are naturally occurring on the European continent, so native species. And EU wildlife law also neglects the protection of animals in captivity, usually implicitly, because the legislature is not always very explicit about why it neglects animals in captivity, but the underthought is that's because those animals in captivity don't have a lot of ecological value. They can't be rehabilitated, and so they don't have value in terms of, environmental protection and conservation. And then there's another feature. So one first feature of EU wildlife law is that it's very much underpinned by dominant environmental ethics. And then the second feature, which is probably actually the most important feature, the most significant characteristic of EU wildlife law, is that it provides, it's very pro-business in the sense that it provides, a lot of the EU environmental statutes provide a lot of exemptions from animal abuse, but also any sort of, abuse against the environment as a result of business activities. And then I also looked at the case law of the Court of Justice of the EU, and I found some instances where the court would actually recognize the value of animals from more of an animal ethics perspective. And so invoking Article 13 of the TFU, so the TFU being the sort of constitution of the EU, which recognizes animal sentience and recognizes the sentience of animals, of wild animals, which is not necessarily, which the European Constitution doesn't really apply to, and in a way that recognizes the individuality of those animals. And I also looked at the statutes themselves and found some rules that, because they're protecting wild animals at large, because they're very ambitious and they're in protecting wild animals, actually benefit all animals, all wild animals, regardless of their conservation status, regardless of whether they're native to Europe or not. And then the third section of my piece is really about reform proposals. So I really look at the way those wildlife laws are structured in EU law, and we find a very common problem to EU law, which is they're very sectoral. So you have one problem and then one legislation addressing that problem. When, if you want to have something more effective and more inclusive, you would have to adopt what we call more of a horizontal approach that tackles all the problems that are similar to animals and wild animals in general. So one possible reform would be to have more of a horizontal approach, and adopting a general legal regime that would apply to wild animals, as opposed to have one statute for birds and one statute for habitats and one statute for invasive species, etc. And in terms of my methodology, it was very, very classical. I did a literature review of both, what was happening, what philosophers would say about environmental ethics and animal ethics. And then I really looked at the statutes, the EU statutes relevant to the protection of wild animals.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. So let me just change the settings here for a moment. Great. Thank you so much, Alice. So if anyone has thoughts for Alice or questions, please do keep them in store for our Q&A at the end of the session today. And for now, we'll be passing over to Verla Platvoet, who's a PhD researcher at the University of Helsinki. And her journal article was entitled Growth from Common Ground, Animal Welfare in Wild Animal Law. So Verla, I will now pass to you.
Great, thank you, Ian. And thank you for having me here at this roundtable. So my article is based on a chapter of my PhD research, and my research looks at wild animal law in Europe, basically. And then within this chapter and this article as well, I look at wild animal welfare specifically. And the main argument I try to put forward is that EU wild animal law contains welfarist provisions regarding the welfare of wild animals, which is in that sense similar to animal welfare law more generally, instead of like an opposing legal system. So that's also why the title is Growth from Common Ground. So this argument consists of a couple of like building blocks, basically, with the first one being that animal welfare as a legal objective includes wild animals. And it does so through its, like, I argue that animal welfare has two different components. So there's the component of anti-cruelty, which means the prohibition on unnecessary suffering, so like a negative duty. And there's also the component of humane treatment. So this is more of a positive duty. And I say that this is the component of animal welfare that we see with captive animals. So where we say that we should provide water and food to captive animals. These kind of regulations and laws don't apply to wild animals, but I argue that the anti-cruelty component does apply to wild animals, and that this is therefore also the core of animal welfare as a legal objective. And so this anti-cruelty component of wild animal welfare law you see throughout EU wild animal law. So that is the second building block of my argument, where I look at a multitude of instruments, such as Article 13 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the Invasive Alien Species Regulation, and the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, which are the main conservation instruments of the EU. And I kind of argue how you see this reference to unnecessary suffering throughout. So even, for instance, in the Invasive Alien Species Regulation, which is really a regulation that targets invasive animals that threaten the environment. So it's really a regulation that aims to regulate the eradication of animals. Even there, you see this recognition that we shouldn't harm animals if it's avoidable. So, in other words, the second building block states that wild animal welfare as unnecessary suffering, like the prohibition of unnecessary suffering, is present in EU wild animal law. And then finally, I say that wild animal welfare law is welfarist in the sense that it converges the protection of wild animal welfare with human interests. So here I use the welfarist theory of Gary Francione together with the interest convergence theory of Annie Setz, to kind of argue that both of these apply to wild animal welfare law in the same way as they apply to captive animal law, except that the human interests are just different. So with captive animals, we have human interests, for instance, in food or entertainment or medication, like science, and these kind of course, justify like the harm that we do to the animal in the law. And if we have an interest in their well-being, for instance, with pets, then we have kind of a convergence between the interest of the animal, which is, of course, an interest to not be harmed, and our own human interest. And then you also see that the protection that the law grants to these animals is very high. So I argue in this third building block that the same logic applies to wild animal welfare law, except it's mostly dependent on the human use in biodiversity. So we see that animals that are a part of biodiversity, like endangered species that are listed under the Habitats and Birds Directive, their interests converge with the human interest in biodiversity, and it means that they are protected fairly well under these instruments. So there's a prohibition on killing them, on disturbing them, etc., etc. Whereas invasive species, for instance, have a divergence with our own interest, of course, and that means that that the law regulates their eradication, but still with this like baseline of unnecessary suffering, because that is what animal welfare is all about. So having this argument then hopefully set through these three building blocks, I then kind of try to look forward. So knowing this, like knowing that the law, like animal law, including wild animal law, regulates the welfare of animals through the human interest, through the human use of them. How can we change this? So how can we rethink animal law? And then I focus on wild animals mostly. And one theory I offer here is that of posthumanism, not to exclude the others, but I think posthumanism is just a very interesting theory, but I also think there's a lot of value in, for instance, Earth jurisprudence or others. But I focus on posthumanism and the features there of entanglements, of the rejection of human dominance, and of a recognition of agency. So then I apply these factors to the laws that the legal instruments that I discussed prior, to kind of theorize how the law would change if we would have a post-humanist view on the law and on wild animals in there. So that is all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Verla. So we will now move on to our next speaker, who is, where are we? Katie, yes, there you are. So our next speaker is Katie Sari, who's a lecturer at the University of Liverpool. And Katie's article, which she'll be presenting on, is called A Walk on the Wild Side, Wild Law and the EU's Nature Restoration Law. So Katie, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here to discuss my work and also the work of the other individuals contributing to this important special issue. So my work specifically focuses on a new piece of legislation introduced into the European Union, which is a nature restoration law, and it aims to sort of at least tentatively apply some theoretical and sort of philosophical arguments to the nature restoration law, in view of the fact that the EU is a market-driven sort of entity, and sort of the potentially are limitations to the application of these theories, but I still think it's important nonetheless. So just the first point is that sort of the aim to restore nature across Europe, and I just wanted to sort of touch upon the rationale for its introduction. So obviously the nature restoration law is adopted against the backdrop of significant decline, loss of biodiversity across Europe. And it's adopted explicitly on the basis that these problems, biodiversity loss and other sort of problems, extinction of species, are not addressed, at least fully, through existing legal approaches and legislative regimes, including sort of some of the EU's conservation laws, which do have restoration objectives, at least to a limited extent. And the European Commission recognises this in its explanatory memorandum for the nature restoration law, suggesting that the outlook for biodiversity and ecosystems is bleak, and that this shows that the current approach is not working. So my intervention is specifically sort of levelled at that idea, the sort of Commission's recognition that existing approaches aren't working. And my sort of analysis is, you know, if these current legal approaches aren't working, if they are inadequate, what are the sort of deeper critical philosophical reasons or roots of their inadequacy, and what are the possible alternatives? So in terms of sort of restoration in the European Union, the nature restoration law is based on the need to restore biodiversity and nature across the EU on the basis that just protecting nature or preventing further decline is not on its own sufficient to address a broader environmental and biodiversity crises. And sort of restoration efforts generally are these sort of passive or active efforts to bring ecosystems or habitats back to a former sort of semi-natural or historic state, and encourage on the sort of basis encourage wildlife and species then to return to ecosystems and habitats. And the nature restoration law tries to do this through a set of sort of binding targets for member states to reverse biodiversity and nature loss, and the sort of various different obligations and percentages that the member states must sort of adhere to and align to, which are detailed in more detail in the article itself. But in terms of the use of legal theory, I sort of used Earth jurisprudence as the main theory, a theoretical approach to apply to the nature restoration law to assess its potential to sort of restore nature. And in particular, I look at the sort of practical application or implementation of Earth jurisprudence theory through the adoption or development of wild laws. And the sort of reasons I've sort of used this theory is it's a part, I think Earth jurisprudence and wild law theories are sort of part of a broad need to assess the extent to which the legal regulation of the environment more broadly, not just within the EU, how sufficient the existing approaches are to sort of address present challenges and ecological decline. And I think that the sort of using Earth jurisprudence suggests that it will inevitably involve sort of reconceptualizing fundamental legal concepts and also the notion of law itself. So obviously, just as a caveat, I acknowledge that the nature restoration law as a piece of legislation can only ever be a band-aid for these sort of larger structural problems. But Earth jurisprudence for our purposes is based on a number of broad ideas. I'm sure you're aware of sort of the assumption that an anthropocentric standpoint in policy and lawmaking is inevitable. The idea that existing approaches in law conceptualize the human world as something that's completely separate from and superior to the rest of nature, and sort of these approaches that envisage and entrench a sort of discontinuity between the different living beings. And the sort of the way the Western legal cultures in particular recognize and treat nature and the earth as a resource or an object, rather than sort of part of a broader ecological community of living and non-living beings. So Earth jurisprudence is a potential to reframe that relationship between humans and the rest of nature, based on the principle that humans are just part of a broader Earth community, sort of this wider system of communities, including plants, animals, rivers, ecosystems, etc. And they're dependent, humans are dependent upon the Earth for survival. So in terms of the indications of a wild law approach, I looked at sort of 3 broad areas that could indicate a wild law approach, and this is based on how far it aligns with ideas of Earth-centred governance, also acknowledging the fact that there are plenty of other indicators as well that I didn't have time to discuss in the article. So not to say that these are the only or the sort of the most important, but for my purposes, I thought they were the most helpful. So I looked at sort of the value accorded to nature in the nature restoration law, the purpose of the measure, and also its alignment with ecological criteria like the principle of interconnectedness between forms of life. And for the most part, the nature restoration law doesn't necessarily recognise the intrinsic value of nature. It recognises nature as sort of instrumental to human purposes. In terms of the purpose of the measure, I focus specifically on the way sort of nature restoration is framed as sort of economically beneficial, which I thought was problematic. And also the alignment with ecological criteria, in the sense that what the nature restoration law does is essentially establish what's called a patchwork of restoration obligations. It's not necessarily about whole-scale restoration, it's about specifically targeted ecosystems across Europe, which is very similar to the sort of approach taken in the Habitats Directive as well. So in terms of the conclusions then, I thought a pragmatic approach to identifying elements of wild law in existing sort of jurisdictions is fruitful if it's only to highlight the key impediments to the realisation of such principles in modern legal systems, because on the face of it, legal reform is likely to be ineffective as a response to sort of the Anthropocene and the crises if it continues to utilise nature as this resource or object. And likewise, governance systems sort of constitute this quite flawed approach to legal systems, sort of this fixation on the subject-object divide and the use of nature as a resource to be efficiently used and exploited. And there's a real need to move away from those sort of binary distinctions and categorizations and recognise this interconnectedness and interdependence between different forms of life. Sorry, Ian, I'm finished now.
You're all good. Thank you so much, Katie. Okay, so as I said before, we'll have a Q&A at the end, so do keep your questions or comments for all of our speakers to hand. For now, I will turn to Hakon Evjemo, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Dundee, and he will be presenting on his journal article, which is entitled Delivering Spatial Justice to Wildlife, Merleau-Ponty and the Politics of Inhabitation. So I will pass to you, Hakon.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So my paper is really about spatial justice and how we can deliver it to non-humans. It then explores why particular interpretations of space that we use for now actually preclude non-humans from being considered as a beneficiary of justice. And finally, it then explores how phenomenology, specifically Merleau-Ponty's account of embodied phenomenology, can actually open us to the idea that non-humans actually contribute to spatial meaning and should therefore be considered beneficiaries of spatial justice. So what is spatial justice? Spatial justice is really the idea that the way we organize and regulate space is connected to justice. So a really good example is the way we regulate public areas to prevent places from people from smoking in particular areas, or restricting the rights to protest. Those kind of things where we regulate space actually impacts whether we do justice or injustice to different types of people. Now, traditionally, spatial justice is understood mainly within the human realm. We adopt this human interpretation of space, and then we only discuss how we deliver justice to other humans. And I think we can extend the idea of spatial justice to non-humans, but in order to do that, we first have to recognize non-humans as beneficiaries of spatial justice. And in order to do that, we first have to start treating them as co-producers of spatial meaning. So we have to start recognizing them as not only being dependent on the land or space, but also a contributor to it, providing to the health of the land itself. Once we start doing that, then we can start going, okay, great. Non-humans in particular areas are doing these great things for the land. We should recognize them in our decision making and deliver spatial justice to them. So I want to really talk about first how we're currently failing to do that. And I think it's down to this idea that we tend to, in the law, conceive of property in terms of this thing called objective space. So objective space, in simple terms, is the idea of space being this absolute container, this homogeneous plane that is separate to the things it occupies, that occupy it. And it kind of creates this understanding that the things inside it are just occupants, they're passive, there are forces acting on them, this kind of Newtonian world that we live in. I think the law tends to do this. And I think the way the law does this, especially when it conceives of property in terms of objective space, is it denies the agency of non-humans in two very important ways. First, it denies the agency of humans insofar it assumes that the spatial meaning or objective space is the only way of understanding what space is. So it completely excludes non-humans from even being a contributor of what spatial meaning is. Secondly, we tend to impose this concept of space onto the world, which means we don't even give the world a chance to come to us and provide its interpretations of what space is. I think this leads to what I call a politics of occupation, where we understand property as this kind of vacuum, and then we occupy it with things. But then this allows us to cut up and territorialize property. But in doing so, we kind of ignore that layer of processual interspecies relationships that happen beneath that construction that make the land what it is. And this is problematic because it excludes non-humans from the discussion completely. And I think this needs to be addressed. And the way to address that is to really think about objective space and whether it's the only way of understanding what space is, and it's the only way of conceptualizing what property is. So this leads me to Merleau-Ponty. So if anyone doesn't know, Merleau-Ponty is a French phenomenologist who engages in questions like, what does it mean to be in the world as a body and to be engaged in the world? And for Merleau-Ponty, this idea of objective space isn't fundamental. It's actually a second order reflection or idea that we gradually develop and start imposing on the world. So for Merleau-Ponty, before we occupy space, we inhabit space, which is an entirely different idea of what space is. Where objective space was this kind of separate container in which things occupy, spatial inhabitation, or the idea of inhabiting space, is relational. Spatial meaning is a thing that happens when we make contact with other bodies, and then meaning comes from that. So to inhabit space is something we do before we occupy space. And Merleau-Ponty gives examples of, I'll give an example of, imagine you're walking through a high street and you're not really thinking about where you're going. You're not really imposing this idea of objective space onto the world. You just kind of navigate it. Your body kind of knows what it's doing. There's this kind of inhabitation, that almost intuitive engagement with the world around you. And for Merleau-Ponty, this is more fundamental than the idea of objective space. And if we engage with this idea of spatially inhabiting the world, it changes the way we understand non-humans. They no longer become things in the world, but other bodies that engage with us and produce meaning in our interaction. And if we can start to think of property, we can maybe start to include them in discussions about spatial justice. So when we think of space as this way of inhabiting the world, we can do two things. We can rethink property as a site of spatial inhabitation. In the same way, perhaps you can think of the pedestrianisation of property. When we pedestrianise space, we think about all the different considerations, all the different people. It's more than just being occupants. If we think of them as inhabitants, we can maybe include non-humans in that and treat them as pedestrians as well. It also changes the way we engage with non-humans on a practical level. Rather than just simply imposing meaning onto them, we open a dialogue with them to see what property can mean in the future. Yeah, that's my talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Håkon. So, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Eliane Verniers can't join us today, but her article is also included in our special issue. And she writes on exploring a legal framework for compassionate conservation, guidance from the deep ecology movement. So, as is probably evident from all of our speakers so far, the issue covers a vast range of different types of theory that wildlife law scholars and practitioners may wish to engage with. Turning now then from the journal articles in the special issue to our two review articles. Now, we're very fortunate to have two review articles that are very much on topic, covering legal theory texts and theoretical engagements with them. So very excited to hear from Saskia Vermeulen, who is a reader at the University of Strathclyde and whose review article is entitled Relational Interdependence, riffing on Margaret Davis's Eco-Law, Legality, Life, and the Normativity of Nature, through the poetics of relations and symbiotic knowing. So, let me find you. Yes, Saskia, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the very kind invitation to be here tonight, and also for allowing me to review Margaret Davis's book. With something I didn't tell you when you asked me, it was actually the first time that I wrote a book review. And it was actually quite challenging. First of all, taking on Margaret Davis's work is not an easy task. And then being this the first time that I did a book review proved to be quite challenging. And yeah, listening just now to the papers, I think it's a really perfect choice. Margaret Davis's book really fits very nicely with and really complements a lot of the discussions that I've heard tonight. So I decided in my review paper, and it's quite, yeah, it's a bit of an extensive sort of dialogue between Margaret Davis's work and my own interest in the topic. And I must admit, I am not an animal lawyer, and I'm coming more from a legal anthropological background into this topic. But basically, I really enjoyed reading Eco-Law, and I think it really brings something new and refreshing into the debate about environmental law, particularly a lot of the work that we've heard already tonight around rights of nature, earth jurisprudence, wild law. Davis's really contributes some new, exciting thinking around, which is within philosophy already quite well explored, but I think within a legal context quite novel and refreshing is this idea around agency and the kind of normative value of organisms. So Davis really makes the point that nature, be it animals, plants, the earth, that they produce their own values and norms. That's her starting point. She does then break it up in kind of different and separate subcategories, and she engages with very theoretical framings to make the point how different organisms, both living and non-living, human, non-human, although she focuses much more on the non-human, how they actually create this this normativity and that they have intrinsic value. So she engages with physicists, with biologists, and the main purpose of these really in-depth kind of engagements is to make the point that nature is vital, essential, active, and emergent, rather than being passive and mechanical, which, if we look into the sort of evolution of science, but also law. We often see that, and we've heard that tonight in all the papers, that we often consider nature, being passive and a subject and an object of law. But what I wanted to do in my review was to open up some of the discussions that Davis is opening up and adding to some of her reflections. And the first thing that I wanted to do is, Margaret Davis has mentioned throughout her work that she is actually very much indebted to worldviews, ideas, philosophies, thinking of Indigenous communities. And I wanted to pick up a bit further on that by sort of bringing back the question around agency to a question of humanity as well, and who is the human here. And although Davis is sort of really mentioning that she is indebted to Indigenous people, she really doesn't unpack that further in her work for all right kind of reasons. And she acknowledges that she's been indoctrinated in a kind of positivist way of thinking about the world and also law. But I do think it merits to actually do take a bit of a pause and challenge law as well, and particularly challenge maybe those of us who are writing from and have been indoctrinated in this very positivist thinking, both about law and science, that we can actually learn from other communities of practice. So I injected in my review some fantastic work from Black feminist cultural theorists, particularly Hortense Spillers and Sylvia Wynter, who really unpack and deconstruct further these Western conceptions about humanity and use the Black body as a thinking framework to critique how the Black body has been reduced to an object of regulation, which we can also can extend to what we've been talking about tonight around animals and nature in general. A second point that I really was quite keen to explore further, and maybe where I'm pushing a little bit against some of the propositions of Margaret Davis, is that although I really appreciate how she brought in the natural sciences and how she has engaged with physicists, biologists, etc., she mainly engages with Western scientific paradigms. And building further upon what I've done with Black feminist cultural theorists, I think it's worth sort of expanding that further and sort of take a decolonial approach and engaging with the work of, for example, Aimé Césaire, who is very critical about Western scientific paradigms, and that we actually need to kind of restory our thinking about sciences from different perspectives. I do that through three main bodies of work. One is through a kind of poetic reading of sciences and work with the work of Alexis Gum, who again uses the Black body to think differently about science, but also using, secondly, in my piece, engaging with biosemiotics and considering biological processes as signification, as a semiotic activity, and that law actually is not about just human language, but that we can also work with the language of nature and sort of have an understanding of semiotics beyond human language. And third, and finally, I also wanted to acknowledge the work of Michel Serres, who Margaret Davis is familiar with that work, but one of the very few lawyers actually engaging with Serres' work who write about the natural world as the root of language, as a way again to challenge law further and the language of the human, the anthropocentrism being central in the law. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Saskia. So now for our last presentation, we turn to Romain Truffart, who is a Nansen professor in Arctic studies at the University of Ukurevri in Iceland. And his review article is entitled Of Kins and Laws on a Burning Earth with Matilda Arvidsson and Emily Jones's International Law and Posthuman Theory. So Romain, I will now pass to you. And I also apologize because I did not think to check with you about the pronunciation of your surname. So I hope I got that close to correct.
That's all right. Thank you so much, Ian, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share my reflections with everybody today. So, as you said, this presentation is based on my article/book review I wrote, which engages with a wonderful collection put together by Matilda and Emily. It was published last year by Routledge, and which is also a book I spent most of last year thinking about and with. And as this was the first time I was given the chance and space to engage so deeply with a book. So again, thank you so much, Ian, for this opportunity. So we're living through what Arvidsson and Jones describe as a moment of planetary reckoning. And this moment has many names, but we've often come to know it as the Anthropocene. The Earth is quite literally burning, and international law appears paralyzed. There's no actual response to solve planetary crises. What Arvidsson and Jones offer with their book is not just a call for critique and reform, but really means to acknowledge and recognize or recon with international anthropocentric, colonial, and sovereign logics. And what I wanted to do in my review was to reflect with and extend the intervention by thinking through posthumanisms as a critical legal method. At its core, the book's argument and mind is that international law cannot meaningfully respond to the crises of the Anthropocene while reimagining within its existing ontological boundaries. So we have sovereignty, legal subjectivity, territoriality. All of these categories are not neutral categories. They're products of a Euro-Western legal imaginary that have enabled ecological devastations and especially for this special issue, I guess, multi-species violence. Arvidsson and Jones and their contributors propose a different orientation, one that is grounded in relationality, materiality, and especially care. They take seriously the idea that law can be remade through new stories and new ethical attachments. So, for example, what Donna Haraway calls making kin. In my review of sought not simply to summarize, but to think, as I said, with this volume. And for me, I think what was quite generative about posthuman international legal theory was to think of theory as practice of situated legal engagement. In particular, for example, in her chapter, which is the first chapter after the introduction, Matilda Arvidsson calls on us to cut the frame differently. What that means is to think the categories, as I said, through which international law makes the world intelligible. And this requires engaging law not as abstraction, but as corporeal, effective, and material. And this is a call to reckon with the real violence of legal forms. And yet, as Arvidsson and Jones insist in the introduction, it is also a call to reimagine or to imagine otherwise, to remain hopeful without being naive. One of the most compelling contributions in the book is, or at least for me, was the reimagining of the common heritage of mankind as the common heritage of kinkind. Which is a chapter Emily Jones wrote with Chris Van Eyck and Gina Heathcote. And they turned to speculative fabulation as a method of legal critique and creation. They ask, what would international law look like if it were rooted in kinship, reciprocity, ecological responsibility, and what this would mean for legal concepts we take for granted, such as the common heritage of mankind in the Article 136 of the United Nations Declaration on the Law of the Sea, that declares the area, so the seabed, and its resources are the common heritage of mankind. While this could seem a utopian gesture or just theorizing for the sake of theory, I think what it does is it's a way of displacing international extractive logics from ownership to obligation and from mastery to care. And so this brings us, even if it's fabulation, this brings us to thinking about concepts that we take for granted, as I said, through these new relationships. And really, I think that what they bring is also a concept, another key concept from Haraway, or another key term, this idea of reworlding that is central here. It means imagining and inhabiting the world differently. Not some distant future, but different kind of present that is informed by relational ontologies and multi-species entanglement. So what does this mean for international law? I think, in my view, international law and post-human theory opens the door to kind of jurisprudence and engagement with both legal practice and theory that reject these sort of binary about new kind of theory, so the binary of critique and compliance, for example. And it invites us to engage the materiality of law, its violence, its failure, but also its capacities to promote care and relationship or relationality. As Haraway says, it matters what story makes the world. And this book really insists that the stories international law tells and the story it silences must be reimagined. And my review, I really try to affirm this call. So really, in the face of, as I said, sovereign ruins, climatic flames, which is one of the subheadings I used, feminist posthumanism does not retreat into theory. It offers a grounded relational, imaginative practice of legal reworlding. And in a world where resistance feels increasingly futile, perhaps reworlding or this sense of practice is no longer a choice, but also a necessity. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Romain. So at this point, we have heard from all of our authors, a fantastic range of work, which I'm really excited to get into the discussion portion of our event to dive into in even more detail. So now we're very lucky to be joined by Matilda Arvidsson and Emily Jones. I had the hope that we might be able to invite as discussants the authors of some of the books that were reviewed in this special issue, and I'm very grateful that Matilda and Emily both said yes. So we're very lucky to be joined by Matilda Arvidsson, who is an associate professor in international law and an assistant senior lecturer in jurisprudence at the University of Gothenburg, and Emily Jones, who is a New Act Fellow at Newcastle University. Thank you both so much for joining us, and I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on the works that have been presented here, the special issue as a collective, and the themes contained within those. So I hand over to you, and of course it is up to you which order and you would like to offer your thoughts.
Right. So we actually didn't decide anything on beforehand. So I don't know, Emily, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to. Do you want me to?
Please do.
Yeah. Okay, fine. I can go. Yeah. No worries. Yeah, I'm aware of the time as well. I know people are probably getting tired, so I'll try and be brief, but I try to kind of break this down, my reflections, into some themes. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I have kind of two key themes. So the first one is the relationship between theory and praxis, which I think the issue really focuses on really well. And then the second I want to talk about is novel theoretical interventions. So in particular, I want to focus here on contributions to issues relating to property, representation, and reworlding. So that's what I'm kind of going to talk about. So yeah, it was such a pleasure to read this collection as a whole, and so many different kind of theoretical insights and practical insights. And I think this issue makes a vitally important contribution to wildlife law, but also I would add to environmental and animal law more broadly. And as Ian's editorial notes, while there have always been theoretical contributions made in wildlife law, the main contributions to the field that the field has made have been doctrinal, or at least these are the parts of the field that have garnered the most attention. So this issue is really needed because what it does is showcase how theoretical approaches are no longer on the margin of the field, but are actually really central and speak back to the core of wildlife law. And again, as Ian noted in his introduction today, the issue doesn't just showcase one theory, but it looks at multiple different theories, which is also really exciting to see. So starting to kind of thinking about my themes, as I said, the first one I want to think about is kind of theory meets praxis. So one thing that I found really interesting reading the different articles in this issue was the kind of focus on case studies. So we have Alice, we have Violet, we have Katie, they all focus on specific EU law frameworks. And then we have Eileen, for example, who focuses in on conservation. And I think this is really interesting because I think one of the critiques that's often thrown at theoretical or more social legal approaches is this idea that they're too abstract. But each of these papers really applies the theories that they are using, whether it's thinking about animal and environmental ethics to challenge the kind of business interests idea within the EU law, as Alice does, or kind of thinking about earth jurisprudence and wild law, as Katie does, which she kind of likewise uses to kind of think about, well, challenge that nature as resource logic that underlies a lot of EU law. Or we have Violet, who uses posthumanism, and I'm going to come on to speak a little bit more about that shortly. But each of them really grounds their critique in the substantive case studies, which I think is really good. It bridges this theory and praxis divide that we have arguably seen in wildlife law and lots of other areas of law, including my own field of international law, for a long time. So the issue really showcases the importance and relevance of theory for praxis. So theory isn't over here and praxis isn't over here, they're actually deeply intertwined. But at the same time, the papers in the issue not only work to showcase what theory can add to the law, but they also push at the boundaries of theory. So this is my kind of second intervention that I want to make. So contributing to theoretical development too. And this is done in part by applying theory and thereby showing its relevance and limitations as applied, but also through more direct conversations with the theories themselves and kind of developing them through particularly non-human and wildlife law engagements. So for example, Violet's article, which I mentioned previously, argues that post-humanist approaches can be used to move beyond a welfarist model, so a model that protects non-human animals only as long as they are of interest to humans, to one that recognises non-human animal agency. In the meantime, we have Hakon's paper, which, by providing a spatial analysis, notes how wildlife is part of and co-produces spatial justice, but also property. And I found this paper really interesting because Hakon thereby challenges debates not only in wildlife law, but also speaks back to property law, to kind of critical geography models, calling for a better account of the non-human and non-human agency there too. And then we have Saskia's paper as well, which is equally wonderful and uses Margaret Davies' work, as we heard, on eco-law to develop ideas of human and non-human connection. And I think this paper is particularly interesting because this is also a question that comes up time and time again, especially in post-human or like more than human rights of nature spaces, which is this kind of, can humans ever represent nature? That's often a thing that's thrown at these kind of ideas. And through Margaret Davies, Saskia's article really speaks back to this. It kind of showcases that humans and non-humans are connected. And in a sense, it shows how it's not about representation, but a kind of deeper epistemological change about better understanding those connections. And this speaks back to kind of Indigenous responses to this question too. So the kind of Indigenous response to rights of nature is limited because it's only about representation is, well, that's a red herring and it doesn't make sense from our worldview because we are connected to nature. It's not about representation at all. And I think what I really loved about reading Saskia's response and through Margaret Davies as well is that it kind of, we see a similar response to this question of representation coming through, similar response to the kind of Indigenous view, but it situates it within other legal lineages. It kind of showcases that these points of connection are also within kind of Western and European frameworks of thought, which I think is really, really nice. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, we have Roman's wonderful, extensive review of the book that Matilda and I edited together, which we are both so deeply grateful for. And it's, yeah, such a critical and in-depth engagement with the book. But one of the things I love most about this review is how Roman takes the book and expands it. So he notes not only how post-human feminism is a useful tool for tackling lots of issues in the Anthropocene, but he kind of expands our vision. And to kind of go back to the start of this short intervention, he shows how reworlding must involve legal change. And I think that that theme really speaks back to this issue as a whole. It's one of the key takeaways for me, that theory is necessary because it can allow us to see the world differently. And this is especially important in these times, where dominant theoretical paradigms of humanism and anthropocentrism have been shown to have led us to the environmental catastrophe we are now facing. And as Roman notes, we need new paradigms, new ways of thinking about the law to address this crisis moment that we are in. And I think the issue as a whole really showcases this, the necessity of theory in that endeavour. So I will end on that note, but I just want to say well done to all of you for bringing this together and for being part of such an important and inspiring issue. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Emily. Shall we come to you now, Matilda?
Yes, and so thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all authors and editors as well, and Emily. It's been fantastic reading, but absolutely amazing to be here today to hear you speak about your work as well. I wanted to bring us do a little bit more of thinking of one of the themes that Emily brought up, and that's what theory is and does. And it has to do with something that we all have in common who are authors. Me and Emily, we've been thinking about this a lot. So we are lawyers. Now, to many people, this may sound like, oh, great, we have good salaries and we decide a lot of things. But it also means that we know things. So one of the first and most important questions of any theory is to ask, what do we know as lawyers? What is our knowledge? And because we are trained in doctrinal law and we are asked to excel in it, and we have to do it, we have to know the law intimately. It's so easy to be drawn into also defending it because we know it intimately. So the second question, very practically, when thinking about theory is, how do we claim to know what we know? We do exegesis. We talk about the articles, we throw the conventions into the debate, and we excel. But as the articles in this collection show, there is so much more that we actually know in doing so. And the third question that I think that this collection of articles and modes of thinking really brings out brilliantly. And that's the question of what is needed for us to know and do otherwise. So having gone through all these steps, what do we, and I'll come back to the question of the we, what do we know? How do we know it? And how can we, because we know how we know what we know, think and therefore do differently? The second step, which is also such an interesting challenge, I think, in all of the articles and book reviews, is who are we? Who do we collaborate with? Who do we see as our kins? What do we bring on when we call for a legislator to help out? What are the drawbacks of that kind of pull towards power? Who are we when we collaborate with the companies that are driven by profits, but who also actually sit on a lot of the power where we want change? So who are we in thinking and doing otherwise? Now, I want to come to the end of this by saying out loud what I've been thinking all through this, these wonderful presentations and through my reading, and that's feminism. Because the basic questions of feminism is, what are the structures of oppression? Doesn't matter who is oppressed. What are the power structures? What modes do we have of coming together? What are our modes of thinking and doing otherwise? And how can we live more hopefully in this together, even as we are not and will never be one and the same? So I end by a call to think and do more, an invitation to think and do more with feminist theory as a basis for thinking and doing as legal scholars and practitioners in this field. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matilda. And thank you both for your generosity with your time in joining us today and for offering your really fascinating thoughts on the works in the issue. It's been really wonderful. So thank you again. Okay, so at this point, we have some time remaining for Q&A. So I open the event up to the floor for any and all questions and comments that anyone has for any of our authors or our hosts or our discussants, if you like. You're welcome to ask generally framed questions that any of our authors can respond to, or more targeted ones, whatever you prefer. And you're welcome to raise your hand and then unmute yourself, or to post them in the chat and I can read them out for you. So I can see we've had one question come in already while we've been discussing from Franziska. This question asks, so it says, thank you for some inspiring and progressive thoughts. I work on human-wildlife conflict and I have two questions. So these are generally framed, so any of our authors or discussants are welcome to contribute here. What is and what should be the definition of a problem animal? And second, what differentiates a problem animal, a wild species, from what we call a pest? What justifies the differential legal treatment of each? Would anyone like to contribute any thoughts in response to this question? Yeah, Matilda, you had some thoughts on this.
So just very briefly, so I just want to contribute because from the perspective of legal histories, to just throw it out there that I'm working currently on a project on Congo in 1881 to 1908, and this question comes up in the colonial setting all the time, and pests there would be in the early years, which would be around 1885, 86, lions would be a pest considered. So the general response would always be that the definition and the delineation comes with the kind of power that is behind, and the ideology that lies behind that legislator and the legislative power.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Matilda. Richard, you had some thoughts in response to this one as well?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think a slight variation on I think what Matilda mentioned there. It's, I think first thing that really strikes you about international wildlife law, especially go back in history, is how much of it is all about eradicating wildlife. And what we think about today of ultimately protecting wildlife really wasn't the whole thing. We look things going back to eradicating aphids because they were attacking a particular French grape, and that would be bad for wine production, so they've got to go. And perhaps most strikingly, we have the concept of some of the early conventions, the birds useful to agriculture, and something that isn't useful to agriculture was clearly deemed a pest and then slated for eradication. And I think there's some really interesting discussions on how we use theories and the language attached to those theories. Vito DeLuce has explored this in the Journal of Environmental Law, for instance, and other work. But one thing, just to draw your attention to some of the scholarship in the journal, particularly from the Global South, and it's really, really interesting where we see perspectives on human-wildlife conflict from the Global South as opposed to the Global North. And we've had some really interesting papers from Indian scholars and Nepalese scholars about how wildlife is repackaged as vermin. In particular, some of the wildlife that we think of as being quite anthropomorphically appealing, such as primates and other types of monkeys, a real hazard in some of these jurisdictions. And there's a real debate on how we look at some of these animals. And in particular, we look at some of the monolithic structures of international wildlife law, places like CITES, where a lot of the species listing decisions are taken by the global north through sheer weight of numbers. And that then displaces these conservation burdens onto the global south. And there's some really creative ways of using their domestic law to repackage some of these endangered species, or species that are considered endangered, but not necessarily endangered if you are a durian farmer in Thailand or other crops in other parts of the world, and about how that doesn't necessarily gel well with the historical approaches we've taken under conventions such as CITES, CMS, and other things. And again, it kind of draws out what we were exploring right at the very start of this, about how wildlife laws evolved from looking at how those species listing decisions are made to then trying to start to think of, well, why are we making those decisions and through which lens are we applying that decision-making process? And again, that's, I think, where the value of these sorts of reflections really come into their own on this.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. So I'll move forward now because I can see we've got another few questions in the chat. First of all, from Ellen Grace Lesser, we have a question for Alice. So the question is, you mentioned that animal rights folks often prioritize the individual animal regardless of their ecological value. And the question asks, what do you think about this? So I guess, what is your perspective?
Yeah, my perspective is that it's very theoretical, because in practice, I think very few people, at least in the advocacy field, there are very few animal rights organizations who actually, go out there and protect wild animals. Most of the animal rights work is really focused on what we call domestic animals, so animals that live with humans or under are exploited by humans. And so yeah, it's an interesting theoretical position, but I think that's kind of only what it is. And then there's something like, and I think Ian, you've explained that very well in your work, that there's this sort of new approach to animal rights, which was much more inclusive, which doesn't really make a difference between those animals that we should protect and those that we should protect less, and this division between nature, which we actually realized is very much of a construct, and what wouldn't be natural, like the animals wouldn't live naturally, that wouldn't exist naturally. So I think now we're at that point where that divide between animal rights theory and environmental ethics, or the dominant strand of animal ethics, is kind of moot, because now we see a lot of animal law scholars who actually engage. I mean, this is a perfect example on how to treat wild animals, and you even have, outside of the legal field, like a lot of research also in ethics and animal science, like, okay, how do we protect wild animals? Like, what does it mean to protect wild animals? And even some people advocating for intervention, when it used to be absolutely not an option to intervene to protect wild animals from anything, including other animals. So yeah, I think it's that division again is very, or that difference in perspective is very much theoretical, and that in practice it obviously is much more complex and very context specific.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you, Alice. That's really interesting. So Ellen has another question for anyone and everyone. So she asks, were UK wildlife laws changed after Brexit? What are the differences and similarities between EU and UK wildlife law? Wonder if we have anyone who could comment on this. I'm not sure if we have any. Yes, Richard, you are in-house Brexit expert.
I guess so, and I'm just going to sort of work through the PTSD of all of this. Having worked primarily in the Brexit fisheries mess that was my life for about 5 years after this dreadful decision. But so a quick, yeah. So a couple of things I think that are worth noting is that the Law Commission prior to Brexit, around about 2014, did a comprehensive review of biodiversity law, in particular looking at the Wildlife and Countrysides Act. So in many respects, we had quite a significant restructuring of what would be so-called wildlife law from a central UK perspective prior to Brexit, and that hasn't really been touched. The thing that does make this quite a tricky topic is not that there's so much a UK wildlife law, but each of the component parts of the UK have their own wildlife powers. And sort of speaking as taking that hat off and put my devolution hat on. One of the really interesting things about the core authorities of the UK is that they've all had, right from the very start, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, they've always had powers over the environment as being one of the main things that was given to them in the devolution package. They've always been really keen to use this. And the other interesting thing in the Brexit debate is that certainly Scotland and Northern Ireland voted against Brexit as a measure of populace. Wales is slightly 50-50, slightly more towards exiting. But the Welsh government has been very, very keen to preserve a lot of the European standards. So what we're seeing essentially is not a great deal has changed, particularly in things such as recognition of sentience and elements such as that. And we're still sort of disentangling a few other bits and pieces. The one thing I would say is that it's difficult to piece together where wildlife law ends and general standards begin. And we're seeing that with things such as the reform of agricultural law, for instance, where things such as welfare standards are being looked at through the lens of plant health, animal health, but also looking at their compliance with some of our wildlife laws, so to speak. So I think we're pulling on threads, but I guess the major big ticket planks of things that were already in there in the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive haven't really changed, which I think is pretty positive. Whereas we look at things such as water quality, and that has disintegrated in the UK for various reasons and contexts. So thankfully, I think at the moment biodiversity has been sort of shunted unless you happen to live in a river.
Very informative. Thank you, Richard. Yuriko, I can see you've now posted a question into the chat. Shall I read this for you, or did you want to ask us yourself?
You're welcome to read it, Ian. Certainly if no one else had any questions.
I will do. Thanks, Yuriko. Okay, so Yuriko says, it's so exciting to see this work thinking about law and nature at the coalface of legal theory. I see your work as an intervention or provocation to international law as a whole, and would love to hear how all of you position your work within that field, if at all. So, i.e., do you see that more general relevance, or do you think of your work as a wildlife law conversation only? I think that's a really good question. What does everyone think? Would love to hear from our authors on this.
I mean, just to add to that, to explain, I guess, Alice, you mentioned more horizontal approaches to lawmaking, for instance, and we have such a tendency, particularly in public international law, to have this kind of siloed approach. many of the suggestions that you were all making in terms of sort of, well, we're questioning the theoretical underpinnings of so much of animal protection law, that it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on how you position yourself as a scholar even within this broader field.
Thanks, Yuriko.
I mean, I don't really have an answer, but what you just said, Yuriko, made me realize that the international component of EU law actually explains a lot of why the regulatory approach is very much sectoral, because it's always hard to get compromise from all the member states, and so therefore you tend to focus on very specific issues as opposed to trying to regulate things as or activities as a whole. But yeah, I guess I never really thought about my work in the context of international law, because it's true that EU law is international law, but it's a very specific type of international law that's very much binding, and yeah, so I would have to give some more thought to this.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah, I guess that if we think about international laws being kind of a post-World War II settlement, it's really ripe for change 100 years later, particularly with all the decolonial thinking, indigenous approaches to law, feminist approaches to law, and so on, that have been transforming the way we actually talk and think about law now.
Saskia, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'm not working in animal law, so take it with a bucket of salt what I'm saying here. But having worked as a legal anthropologist, I'm often in tension with international law. So I would like to bring it back to a question of methodology as well, and how the theory can maybe also inform how we actually practice also international law. And I think particularly in my own work, and this is where I sort of really pay tribute to the work of somebody like Michel Serres, who argues that we should not, when we do empirical work, that we need to use all our senses, making a link with some of the things that Matilda was saying, these feminist approaches, that we have a more embodied understanding of law and that we sense the law. And I just had a really wonderful conversation a couple of days ago with somebody from Client Earth around chemical pollution. And she mentioned, like, it's not, changing law, it's not so much anymore about the data. The data doesn't speak. And we see that in our current geopolitical climate as well. And if we want to make changes, we need to feel things. So I think for international law as well, I think we need a massive big change, and that requires doing law differently and using different senses and using our bodies to think about the law. That would be my small contribution.
Thank you, Saskia.
Yeah, just to add to what Saskia said, it's kind of made me start thinking a bit more as well. My paper's actually quite more personal than all the others. It really engages with the legal practitioner and how they can rethink themselves as inhabiting space. And it's made me think a lot about, in the paper I talk about Iris Braverman, who talks about how when we give definitions of non-humans such as coral reef, it always begins with a terrestrial bias. So our ideas of what life is, how the idea of single entities, individuals, those kind of things all come with terrestrial biases that we don't really challenge unless we recognize that the coral reef that we're engaging with are more than that. They don't exist in that world. And the idea of spatial inhabitation really means finding ways to engage with them, forming some kind of dialogue with them. Doesn't necessarily mean going scuba diving every weekend, but it means recognizing that the way that coral reef inhabit the world is different to the way that humans do, and checking ourselves when we impose our ideas onto them. And that, I think, can affect the way we define non-humans, especially in international law.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so we've had some engagement with international law now. We also have a question from Emily about engagement with rights of nature. So shall I read this for you, Emily?
Yeah, if you want to, I don't mind. Yeah.
Sure.
Sure.
So Emily was wondering if any of the authors would be willing to reflect on the rights of nature in relation to wildlife law. We've seen a lot of cases, especially in Ecuador, but also elsewhere, where what would normally be covered under wildlife law has been brought under rights of nature paradigms. Do you see this as potentially a good thing that maybe brings in wild law, earth jurisprudence, and non-human / post-human perspectives and beyond? Or are you more skeptical of this? So I'd be interested to hear from any of our authors on this. Yeah, Verla.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really an expert on rights of nature, but I do think there's some risks maybe also with specifically the case from Ecuador that kind of like interprets rights of animals under the rights of nature framework, but still excludes like domesticated animals and invasive animals from this scope. So it's not really this like holistic idea, but very much still yeah, an anthropocentric idea, I would say, of what kinds of nature we should protect. But I do think there is also a lot of promise in the concept, but it needs to stay, I think, grounded in maybe some non-Western ideals. And I also have seen, for instance, the Harmony with Nature documents from the Convention on Biological Diversity. They are kind of also appropriating, for instance, like rights of nature discourse and also earth jurisprudence. Like they're referencing earth jurisprudence a lot, and it's also a little bit tricky, I think, because they can take these concepts and discourses and then kind of make them their own, like make them fit within the already existing traditional frameworks that we have. So I think there's a risk there, but like as a standalone concepts, I think they are very, very promising.
I could perhaps say a little bit on rights of nature because I actually am closely connected to the Rights of Nature organisation in the UK. What I will say is, first of all, that the rights of nature is actually a lot more local than we think. Recently, the River Ouse, the local council declared the recognition of the rights of that river. It's not a legal, it has no legal power, but it's at least the start that the local councils and the local people are starting to recognise that perhaps this is one possible way of attending to things like river pollution and also community ownership and stakeholder participation in legal decision making. I think the rights of nature is absolutely an expression of earth jurisprudence. I think there are some problems insofar it hasn't quite worked out how to facilitate or implement rights of nature in practice. So it's a great idea, but when it comes to legal questions like, okay, how do you understand or represent the rights of a river? I think the current way we understand legal practice isn't equipped to do that. And I think that requires something else. I think that the critique of ecocentrism, which is we need to turn away from this anthropocentric worldview, I think they haven't followed through with that. They haven't applied it to the idea of legal practice, which means challenging the idea of assumed sovereignty of human subjectivity, the idea that we're thinkers. Lawyers are just there thinking about the world and engaging again just as thought. I would argue that they have to reintroduce the idea of the body, because that's the way of challenging anthropocentrism as a practice. And that's a way of basically emphasizing the role of embodiment in legal practice as a way of engaging with nature. So, yeah.
Thanks, Hekwan. I'll ask this other question now because it's connected to the last one. And if anyone has any thoughts on rights of nature, broadly speaking, then you're still welcome to share them. But Ellen has asked, rivers, etc., having their own rights seems similar to animism. Is there a religious element to the ideologies behind these kinds of legal developments and recognitions of rights of nature? Does anyone have any thoughts on this or on rights of nature more broadly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the rights of nature in the West is based on primarily Thomas Berry's work on the Great Work. He borrows, like Saskia talked about, indigenous ideas and cultural beliefs. There's this weird relationship where we recognize Thomas Berry as like an inciting incident, but he also acknowledges the indigenous beliefs before him. And I think we have done one of those things and not the other. So the idea of animism, I think we can draw from indigenous cultures and beliefs, but we're not doing it in the right way. We haven't quite worked out how to do that. I think there is a tension between basic Occidental views on religion and indigenous cultures that we haven't quite overcome. So yeah, a problem.
Thanks, Ekman. Okay, unless we have any other questions, I wonder if we'll come to a close here. I think we've had a good amount of discussion, covering some fairly broad ground. Before I wrap up very briefly, Richard, Yuriko, do you have any parting messages you would like to share?
Just to say thank you so much, Ian, for pulling this together. It's been a wonderful event, and I hope this is a conversation that continues. I'm sure, Richard, through your journal, and Ian, and we're also here if you're interested in running more events through the Global Research Network, or even policy initiatives.
Thank you so much, Yuriko, and thank you again for hosting us today.
A great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And just to echo that, firstly to thank Yuriko for hosting, to thank yourself for curating this excellent collection, and of course to thank the authors for all their exceptional work on developing these ideas and really pushing forward what I think is a really interesting existential conversation about where we're going as a discipline, as a sub-discipline, or where we fit in with all those other parts of animal law, environmental law, and yeah, that these sound like the opening salvos in a much broader conversation that's likely to be replicated across the journal, and hopefully again to also demonstrate that this is a place for theorists as well as the traditional black letter people like myself that have tended to populate the journal across the past. So yeah, very much looking at this from a far more holistic and much more rounded perspective. And if we're going to improve wildlife law as its own discipline and keep it at the forefront of environmental law, then we need to be doing this much more often. So thank you very much to all of you for your contributions and for developing this further.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I very much echo this. Thank you to all of the authors for engaging with the theme of the special issue and for elaborating on your ideas in such an interesting way. It's such a fascinating collection of work, and it was an absolute pleasure getting to work on it with all of you. So thank you for the work. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our discussants as well, again, for your time. And thank you to everyone in the audience as well who has joined us for this discussion today. We're so happy to have you all here. And hopefully we'll have more self-reflective discussions about international wildlife law like this and more events like this as well. So yes, I think we'll draw things to a close there. Thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy your evening or rest of your day, wherever you are.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Nice to see you all.